So, welcome, Fireflies, to this episode of the Outer Brightness podcast. And as you can see, today we have two new guests. Well, I guess not new guests, but you've seen Briana before. But we do have two guests with us today, Briana and Dan. So, we'd like to thank them for coming, and we welcome them to the Outer Brightness podcast. So, Briana and Dan, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So, the reason we have these two guests on our podcast is they're very similar to Paul and Michael, aka Dr. Pepper, and I. They are both post-Latter-day Saints who have found faith in Christ. And so the topic of our episode today is we are going to discuss what it's like being a post-Mormon and being a new Christian. So this episode, we want to really focus on advice for the post-Mormon new Christian. And so Briana and Dan are really going to help us with this topic. So we're going to kind of talk to them, interview them, and give some advice from them, hear their background and their stories, and we'll kind of just have a discussion, go back and forth, and we'll share all of our advice. So we have this kind of shared background, this shared history of being Latter-day Saints and leaving and coming to Christ. So that's going to be the topic of discussion for today. So starting off, let's start off with Briana. So the both of you in turn, so could you give us like a 5 to 10 minute synopsis of your journey from Mormonism and to Christianity?
So I grew up LDS. My parents, they were both converts as adults. And growing up, we were known as the Como Pioneers because we were like the first of our families to be LDS. And growing up, I really idolized my father, and he was a spiritual figure in my life, like the strongest. I kind of hinged my testimony on him because he was the leader, and he led our whole family through growing up in the church and just everything. And I was part of activities. I went to the youth stuff, girls camp and all that stuff. And then years down the road, as I was much older, my parents were going to get a divorce. And that kind of shattered my whole world in that moment. At that time, it wasn't the first time that my father, my parents, they were struggling. And the whole reason why it went so bad is because my dad had cheated on my mom, and this wasn't the first time. And several years ago, before all of that happened, when my dad first cheated on my mom, it was destabilizing for me and my faith, and I became agnostic. I was suffering through depression for several years during that time, and when it happened again, it was much worse, and it was with the same girl that had happened years before.
How old were you when you first found out?
I was 16.
Well, that had to be tough.
Yeah. And I was already struggling with my social circle. I didn't quite have a lot of friends growing up. I only had very few. And I was already kind of just dealing with my own questions of life and everything. And when this happened, it kind of like the church was my foundation for everything. And I felt like I could rely upon it. And my dad, I thought he was very strong, and I realized that he wasn't perfect. But what really got me was when my parents went to go get this taken care of, my bishop, he sided with my dad and gaslighted my mom about everything, basically saying it was her fault that he went and did all these things. And for some time, when I became agnostic, but I was still LDS, but I still kept attending the church, but I was secretly an agnostic. I didn't know if God was real or if the church was true. But I kind of got myself into an abusive relationship and went into some pretty dark paths. And I didn't know if I could keep living with this, and made me question things about God and about hell, because at that point I was suicidal, and if I were to take my own life, I didn't want to go to hell. And so that led me into going into questions. And I found some things about the church, and I also found some things about Christianity because I ran into Jeff Durbin online with the videos from Apologia Church. And then it made me realize that after spending some time, I finally came to the realization that the church was not true, but also that Jesus did everything for me, and I couldn't find fulfillment in other people because they will always let you down. But in Jesus, you have everything. So yeah, that's pretty much my story.
Wow, what a testimony. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I echo Paul's words. I really appreciate your sharing that with us. That must be, I can't even imagine, going through what you've gone through, but thank you for sharing that. I know that's kind of hard, and hopefully we'll make both of you feel comfortable. And, if we ask follow-up questions, we'll try to be careful to, not go too probing. We'll try to be considerate. So thank you for that. I don't have any follow-up questions. Do either of you have questions for her?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you again for sharing that, Briana. So, Dan, would you like to share with us a little bit of your story, your journey from Mormonism to Christianity?
Yeah, absolutely. Briana, thanks for sharing that. It's kind of funny what I've noticed. A lot of people that leave the church, that's kind of the road that they go down, is that agnostic path. And that's kind of where I landed, within my teen years as well. Paul already shared a little bit about, our family and kind of where we stood in Utah, but I never really felt like a good Mormon. And I felt like I was a good person. I was doing a lot of good things. I wasn't a bad kid, but, there were Mormon families in the church that, they wouldn't let their kids play with me. So, because I wasn't the standard Mormon that they saw. So I never really felt like I fit in, even from an early age. And so looking back, there's a few stories that my family used to tell over the years, that are just kind of funny, because even at a young age, I never really saw myself as a Mormon and in this culture. And I'll tell a story. So one family home evening, we were all sitting around the table, me and all of my siblings, and we were all talking about, where do you want to go on your mission? And everybody's like, oh, I want to go to Italy. Oh, I want to go here because, I want to learn a foreign language. And, that was like that Mormon culture, right? I don't know if you guys experienced that at all too. But, it came around to me, and I was like, I want to go to Burger King. So
That's my brother.
And so even at an early age, my mind's on, I want to go to Burger King. We go to McDonald's all the time, but, Burger King sounds really good, that Whopper over there. So, and then, my baptism experience, you guys had that episode the other day about baptism. That got me thinking about my whole experience with that. And I remember I was the last kid to go on the day I was getting baptized, and my best friend went right before me. And I remember turning to my dad and I was like, he was explaining to me, you know, all of your sins will be washed away. And, you know, I was thinking about that. I was like, man, I was thinking of something physical, right? And I knew Kenny was going before me, my best friend. And so I turned to my dad and I go, how are you going to prevent Kenny's sins from getting on me? Since I was the last kid to go. So, you know, there were things that just didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me growing up. And looking back, you know, now that I'm not LDS anymore, you know, it makes even more sense that, you know, I just didn't fit that mold really. And so, you know, at 13 was really when I was just like, I told, you know, that's when I kind of started to rebel. And I'm just like, I'm not going to be this anymore. I'm not going to pretend anymore. And so I had a buddy that me and him were we'd kind of goof off in class. You know, we would go to, after primary, we'd go to our class. And I remember one teacher that I had, he was talking about the devil and how he impacts everything that happens in the world that's bad. You know, it's because of the devil. And so I was just like, I was a smart aleck, and I looking back, I was like, I totally wouldn't do this again. But I said to him, I said, so you're telling me if I stuff a bunch of marshmallows up my nose and they happen to get stuck, that was the devil that made me do that? It's not my stupidity. And I remember this guy, this poor teacher, he was just very straight line Mormon. And he, you know, he wouldn't let his kids play with any other kids in the neighborhood. He would kind of keep them in. And I don't know if you knew him or not, Paul. He lived right next to my friend Tommy Yates. But his wife, she would dress kind of like with the homemade dresses like you see with like.
What was his name?
Ligness. I can't even remember his name anymore. But he got so upset when I asked him the marshmallow question that he sent me back to primary, and I had to go sit with the younger kids to learn my lesson. So, but that
Probably
day,
a good move.
That day they were handing out cookies, so I got 2 cookies that day. So it was fantastic. But yeah, so my mom was really a big driver as far as, you know, telling me that church is true. And, you know, a lot of me hanging on and doing a lot of things throughout my teenager years was impacted by my mom. And I really just wanted to make her proud. And so, you know, I went to seminary. I went through everything throughout high school and all of that until my senior year. And that's when I just told my mom, you know, I'm done with it. I'm not going to do it anymore. So I met a girl in high school, my now wife. I did marry my high school sweetheart, and she was a Lutheran. And so when I met her, I kind of started going to a Lutheran church with her and her family. And really, they kind of helped me through my transition out of Mormonism, and helped answer a lot of questions. And they put up with a lot for me, just trying to,
as do we all,
figure it all out. Yeah. So that's kind of my journey out of it. Any questions from you guys?
That's great. So kind of what age? So did you ever really feel like you identified yourself as a Mormon or a Latter-day Saint, or did you kind of just feel like, well, this is the church I go to, you know, it's not really part of your identity?
And that's what's kind of funny about it. I never really felt like I belonged with them. But even after I left the church, I found myself just defending it all the time. You know, my wife had a really hard time growing up being Lutheran, with going to school with all of the different Mormons and the way that they would treat her and keep her kind of on the outskirts. And so she didn't have a good feeling about that, but I would find myself just defending them against her. And so it's kind of funny that you asked that, because I didn't feel like I really fit in with them, and I didn't feel like I fit in with my wife, because I find myself defending Mormonism.
I've noticed that too with my dad for a long time. There were some things that happened in his life where he kind of went inactive in the church, but he had served a mission before doing that. And it was kind of the same thing. Like my uncle, I don't know, I guess he left the church and he joined some kind of, I don't know if it's evangelical or what kind of church, but he would talk to my dad, and he would say a lot of disparaging things about Joseph Smith on the phone with my dad. And even though he wasn't active at the time, he just got into this heated discussion. He's like, you don't even know what you're talking about. I don't know what your pastor taught you, So it's interesting. Like when you see that opposition, it kind of like stirs up some kind of, I don't know how to describe it, some kind of a visceral emotion, or, this deep seated idea in you that otherwise you wouldn't really think about consciously. It's like when they hit a certain spot in you, it kind of reminds you of something, and it kind of stirs up emotions that have kind of laid dormant for a while. Briana, would you so the same question for you, like, did you ever feel like when you were young that you associated or identified yourself as Latter-day Saint, or?
I did. Yeah, I did. I considered myself a very strong Mormon up until, and yeah, that totally changed my world. But yeah, I really did.
Did you ever struggle with ideas of like, kind of like we talked about, like maybe not quite fitting in, or did you feel like you were in the church and like that's where you belong, that kind of a feeling?
It was kind of both. Like I didn't really fit in very much, but I think it was because I was very quiet and very introverted. I tend to shy away from social interaction, but I loved studying the scriptures and learning the doctrine. I was really big into that. And a lot of the kids my age, like growing up in the church, they didn't care about that. They wanted to go to dances, and going to EFY, all that social stuff. And I was just, yeah.
I can relate to that, definitely. I didn't like the social aspects either. Like my mission was a nightmare those first few months, trying to get out of that shell. It's like I remember being thrown on the street in France, barely knowing how to say hello in French, and my trainer was just like, "All right, go talk to that guy." I'm like, "Oh, what? What am I supposed to say to him? This is crazy. I can't even speak his language." And then I think I remember I muttered a couple words, and then he just kept walking. And he's like, "It wasn't too bad for your first try." So yeah, don't worry. I know I can relate to the whole introvert thing and kind of struggling that way, like feeling part of the group, but because you're not extroverted like a lot of other Latter-day Saints are, it's a little bit of a difference. How about you guys?
Well, I was going to say real quick too, because you were saying how hard it was to interact with somebody for the first time in French, and I was just thinking, like, man, doing it in English wasn't any easier. Go talk to that guy. It's like, well, I do speak the same language as him, but man, this is really awkward and embarrassing.
Yeah, and I was going to say too, I expected to like street contacting to get easier as the mission went on, in terms of once I'm better speaking the language, I'll be able to engage people better. And man, when I was like 9 months in and had really picked up the language well, and I'd go out street contacting in my second area, it was the same. People just walked past you. They just wanted to get to work or wherever they were headed, So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Dan, did you serve a mission?
I did not.
Okay.
Burger King.
Just wanted to ask.
I want to ask you a question, Dan, if it's okay, because I kind of want to know what was going on between you and Paul at that time, because I guess he went on a mission after that, and did he try to bring you back into Mormonism or anything?
I would say somewhat, yeah. I think me and Paul had a lot of discussions. I don't recall any of them off the top of my head, but definitely that there was a lot of pressure from my mom, my brother, my other sister that was real strong in it as well. Yeah, I don't know that I probably spoke a lot of French and just said we just nodded my head to kind of get through it. But yeah, there was a lot of pressure there, and I definitely felt it. And the episode when you guys were talking about the social aspect of the church, I had a lot of friends in the church, and I'm not really friends with them anymore. Other than I've got a few friends that aren't in the church anymore that are my friends, but the ones that are still heavily in the Mormon church are not interested in really interacting anymore. Tried to reach out to a few of them on Facebook, and they just weren't really interested in talking or catching up or anything like that. And when I would go back home, I'd reach out to them and say, "Hey, I'm in town. Do you guys want to go have a beer or something?" and nobody would show up, but my non-Mormon friends, they come and have a beer with me. So that's pretty cool.
Yep. That's the problem. You said the B word. You need to say RB. You need to say root beer. That's the key to getting your Mormon friends to come hang out.
Yeah.
Yeah, but wanted to ask if people want to go hang out and have root beer floats. Just sounds kind of weird. It's like, what is this, like 7th grade?
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, too, when you said that you had some conversations with Paul, because Paul had talked about in previous episodes how he had already started kind of questioning during his mission. So how was that, kind of having those conversations while you were yourself were already having questions, Paul?
It was kind of a weird time, right? I was the first child in our family to serve a mission. My older sister did not. And so I felt a lot of pressure to try to make sure that I brought the younger siblings along the covenant path as best I could, right? And it's interesting to hear Danny say that he doesn't remember much about that, and it's probably just slipped his mind. But I felt like I do feel like I put quite a bit of pressure on you when I came home. I don't know. It was coming back to Utah after having spent 2 years in Europe was a tough transition. Even though I, had spent those years as a Latter-day Saint missionary, it was not Utah, and so being back in Utah was really tough. And, I met Angela, and we got pretty serious with our relationship pretty quickly. And kind of the first chance I got when she said, why don't you move out here to the Cincinnati area, I jumped at it and moved out there. So I was only home from my mission. I got home in May of 1999, and I left Utah in December of 1999, right after Christmas. And Danny, he's 7 years younger than I am, so he was in the middle of his teenage years at that point. I guess probably just starting with your real questioning, because you were probably around 14 at the time or something. And so, when I moved out here, he came out to visit, and of course, you try to put on a good big brother front. Hey, we're faithful in the church, that kind of thing. And of course, I had questions. I remember picking you up from the airport in Louisville and driving back, and you asking questions about different things. And of course, Dad was telling me you were struggling, quote unquote, struggling with the church. And I felt like I put quite a bit of pressure on you to serve a mission. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I feel like in telephone conversations with you, I really tried to encourage you in that direction. And, I felt bad about it because, it was clear it wasn't something you were going towards. But, I was trying to, like I said, bring you along the covenant path. So.
Did you feel it was kind of like, I don't know, when I was really struggling questioning around 2015, 2016, right before I kind of left the LDS church, I kind of ramped up my defense of the church as kind of like a compensation, I guess, for the questions I had. Did you have similar thoughts like that, Paul, when you were talking to Dan or others?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I had aims of becoming an apologist. I wanted to study archaeology and go find the evidence for the Book of Mormon in Central America. That was kind of where my mind was in terms of what I was going to study. I didn't ultimately go that direction, but spent a lot of time online reading. I don't think FAIR had quite kicked off at that point, but reading stuff from Farms and Shields and some of the other apologetics boards and sites that were up at the time.
Cool. Yeah, that's we had kind of a similar experience there. I've noticed that sometimes when we're witnessing to Latter-day Saints and it seems like we're not getting anywhere, a lot of times when they're the most vehement in their defense of the church is kind of when they're almost at their breaking point. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's hard to tell where they are at in their faith. But yeah, so continuing off from kind of where we talked about earlier, unless anybody has anything to add. I wanted to kind of talk more about the transitionary period. So you had both kind of described in your stories the transition between being Latter-day Saint and a Christian. Briana, you kind of talked about how there was a period in your life where you were agnostic. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? I don't want to be too probing, but were you kind of questioning the existence of God and Jesus, or were there certain things of the LDS Church you still held on to that were difficult to let go of? Or would you like to talk more about that?
Okay. Well, so I guess I was just more questioning whether God was real or not. And I kind of went on the belief that, if he was, then Mormonism would have to be true, kind of that kind of mentality. But if he isn't, then I'm just like, what's the point? And so I just kind of like started noticing some of the cultural things that were a little bit off, but it wasn't really so big of a deal. I still like thought that maybe it would be true and I'd give it a shot, but at the same time, I wanted to do my own thing. I was kind of rebellious and just kind of like experimenting in the background while I was still attending church just to see, that kind of thing. And the question was about like the transition. So can you repeat the question about that?
Just more details about the transition from being a believing Latter-day Saint to non-believing, like kind of like, I think you answered it pretty well, like did your ideas and beliefs change slowly over time, or was it kind of like an all or nothing change? Or did you, even between Christianity and Mormonism, did you believe other things? So just kind of that transition period.
Yeah. Well, I guess during that transition, one of the big ideas that Mormonism that affected me was about the Bible. And they believe that it's been corrupted and it's missing precious truths. And during that transition period, one of the questions I wanted to know was whether the Bible could be reliable or not. And I started studying like the archaeology behind it and like the history, and it really got a lot of my attention too, because I'm like, the Bible seems to have a lot more validity than any of the other LDS books of scripture. And so as I delved into that and then the history of Mormonism, I just knew that at that point, I'm like, okay, Bible's a lot more reliable. So I want to look into this Christianity, and at that point too, I was, kind of suicidal. So with my whole, not wanting to go to hell, that's what kind of started that whole thing too. I reached out into a depression support group, and I made a little post on there, and there was this evangelical guy, this older gentleman, and he reached out to me in private messenger, and he started talking to me a little bit about religion, and he almost became an LDS, like a Mormon, years ago. And then he started talking to me about some of the things that got him to not go through with his baptism. And so then he just kind of was there to give me some resources, and that kind of helped me along that path.
That's great. Thank you very much. And you were also speaking earlier about how, so not only you were having more faith or understanding in the authority and the reliability of Scripture, but you were also kind of describing how you could rely on Jesus alone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk maybe a little bit more about that, like learning to trust in Jesus rather than an organization or?
Yeah. So with Jesus, sorry, I might need to take some moments to respond to that question. I had to kind of come to a point when I realized that the Scripture, that the Bible could be reliable, that I'm like, okay, Jesus, I started learning about like his background and everything. And there was a video that I had watched on YouTube. Jeff Durbin did. I don't remember. It was called The Gospel for Mormons, I think. And I think that was actually during that video. I had been watching several of his stuff, but it was during that video where he kind of explained that you don't need this organization to be this sort of middleman for you and God. Like, you can talk to God directly, and he wants you to reach out to him and to have a relationship with him. And for me, as a Mormon, I thought he was that God was just this far distant, like, being that I just didn't really have a close relationship to. Is just kind of this, I don't know, like, you know how you think about kings and queens, or like even celebrities, like they're just these people that are like way up there and you're out of reach with them. But God came down as a man, and he was just as Jesus, and he just kind of became more relatable, I guess. I don't know what else to add to that, but.
So would you say that, so in your transitioning from the LDS Church to Christianity, you would say that God felt closer to you, or he felt more real to you? How did that transition feel like?
Well, I think I came to that point too where I didn't know what unconditional love was like until I understood grace. And before then, I had never experienced that kind of love in my life. So once I did, then that's when it all made sense to me.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Do you guys have anything to add? I know I've kind of taken control of the conversation, so if you guys want to chip in and add anything, go ahead.
I did have a follow-up question for Briana. I can think back to like one part of my teenage years, like where I was kind of in that transition period with you, where I was kind of agnostic, and I was just kind of going through the motions for my family. And I had a paradigm shift where like all my thoughts changed on I was still kind of like, well, maybe it's true. And I don't want to be, they always talk about don't be on the fence. You either have to be here or here. You can't sit on the fence. And I was definitely sitting on the fence. And so there was a point in my teenage years where the paradigm shift. I'm just curious if you had one moment that kind of shifted your view as well, or if it was just consistent throughout.
I don't know if I have like a specific moment when it really happened, but it kind of like gradually just started shifting as I started developing more ideas about things, and going through different experiences. But I started developing this idea that, people weren't perfect. Like the first time when my dad cheated on my mom, it was, it hit me hard, but like I forgave him for it. And I just thought, like people just make mistakes, and, they can change and all this stuff. I had a problem with this one story that, they kind of told this in Young Women's, where this idea that like with the chewed gum, have you ever heard of that one? It's like this idea where like basically if you if you break the law of chastity and get into involves another person before marriage and before you go to the temple, like nobody's going to want you. Like your worth is like all chewed up. Nobody wants to eat chewed gum. So basically we had to be completely virtuous and pure and strive to go to the temple. And I had a problem with that because I thought nobody was perfect. And I'm like, wasn't there repentance? Isn't Jesus, didn't he forgive the woman who had committed adultery? So yeah, there's little moments like that where over time I just started like having some issues with those kinds of things.
I add something to that too. Like, so I have this aunt that was a member of the church just for a short time and left. But she told me, and I guess my experience as a man was different than like what women go through at the church. And that's something I never heard of, the whole chewed gum analogy till I met Briana, because that's all just behind the scenes for me. But something my aunt told me that she was told in the young women's class is if somebody tried to rape her or any of them, that it was better to die than to survive that and be a victim of rape, because having your chastity taken is just that. And I'm just like, that's such a horrible thing to tell people, that even if it's against your will and something happens, like you are no longer virtuous or wanted or worthy, and you never will be again. It's just incredibly strict and disheartening.
Yeah, I never. Well, maybe I had heard it and I just forgotten it, but I hadn't heard the chewed gum example. But I did remember hearing. I can't remember if it was just a thing that Mormons said to each other, or if it was on like a Mormon movie. But they said it's like when you go on a mission, it's better to come home in a box than to come home early. Have you guys heard of that?
I've heard that before.
It's like, oof, man, that's rough. It's kind of the same thing. It's like, really, would a parent? I mean, I didn't hear from my dad or my parents, but I mean, if you were to say that to your kid, that's pretty messed up. Like, you'd rather they die than come home dishonorably.
Yeah,
I remember as a young woman, like they would kind of instill this idea too that you had to marry a return missionary. That other guys who don't go on missions, or if they failed their mission, like they're not worthy either. So that was one of those things too.
Yeah, the paradigm shift that I had when I was either 13 or 14, but I remember, we had a youth gathering, and they were talking about, hey, next week we're going to go to the Martin Harris pageant. And so they were building this pageant up and saying, this is why the church is true, guys. This is going to show you guys why the church is true. And at that time, I was kind of like on the fence and not really leaning either direction. And so I went to this pageant, and I was really into it. I was watching every moment of the pageant, and it got to the point where the pages go missing, and I'm like, okay, he's just gonna redo these pages, and that proves that it is true. And and then no, I'm not gonna retranslate the plates. I'm not gonna do that, because then you're just gonna change them, right? And I was like, that proves that it's not true right there. The fact that he won't go back and retranslate them proves that it's not true in my eyes. And so that was just a real paradigm shift in my whole thought process, as far as I can't believe it anymore, and I really have to find a way to get out of this, right? And so, when I graduated high school, I was dating my high school sweetheart, and her mom, the reservation center, she worked for Southwest Airlines, and they closed the reservation center in Salt Lake. And so her mom transferred to Albuquerque, and I moved with them. And so I remember my dad sitting down with me. It was the night before I was going to move, and he was basically pleading with me not to go, not to do it. And he basically said, if this is really what you want to do, go ahead and do it. But he said, I don't think you should. I don't know that this is the right girl for you. And I told him, I basically bore my testimony to him. I said, this is the girl for me. I love this girl, and I'm going to move with her. And I haven't really looked back. I ended up marrying her down in New Mexico, and had 2 beautiful children now, and I really haven't looked back. So, and I got to say that a majority of my transition from Mormonism to Christianity has been in large part because of her family. That they're Lutheran, and a lot of my conversations that I've had with them, I had to deconstruct everything that I was taught about becoming a god someday, and I'm gonna have my own planet that I'm gonna run. I went through seminary, and I guess it never really clicked that that's not in the Bible. There were things that they connected from the Bible to the Book of Mormon, in seminary class, but that wasn't one of them. And, that was a hard lesson for me to learn. And going to a Christian church, a Lutheran church, and listening to the pastor, there were a lot of ways I thought or things that I thought I knew about God that just weren't accurate. They weren't biblical. And that I think, Paul and I have had a lot of discussions over the years, and I've had to deconstruct a lot of things. And, I really filled in the blank with a lot of stuff that isn't scripture at all, to kind of bridge that from getting from Mormonism to the Bible. So, yeah, it's a challenge. And
so talk a little bit more, Dan, about when you started to attend the Lutheran church with Lauren and her parents. Did you started to attend with them in Salt Lake City before you moved to Albuquerque, right?
Yeah, there's a church in Utah called St. Matthew's that they attended, that I attended a few Sundays with them.
Okay. Is that where you played basketball? Is that where I went and watched you play basketball?
I don't think so. I think that was another Lutheran church that had a gym.
Okay. So just a few times in Utah before you moved to Albuquerque then?
Yeah, I think I attended a few youth meetings with them, youth gatherings and things like that. But really, I think it probably wasn't until I moved to Texas that I really kind of shook some of the agnostic feelings that I had. I never really, I would go, again, it was kind of going through the motion. I believed that there was a God. I just didn't know in what capacity. And Briana touched on a little bit about that relationship. And I really didn't develop that relationship with Jesus until I came to Texas. And there was a pastor at the Lutheran church, Pastor Luke, that, man, he was fantastic. And he would just speak directly to you. He was so in touch and so spiritually in touch with everything that the congregation was dealing with, that it felt like everybody in that room felt like he was talking directly at them and the things that they were dealing with. Every week he would just come and bring it, and just really fantastic. And in a lot of ways, he changed my views and really helped me develop that relationship with Jesus and encouraged me to really reach out and do that.
What was it like starting to attend a Lutheran church, not Lutheran in particular, but just a Christian church, as a former Latter-day Saint? Were there things about the worship service, the communion that were different and difficult for you to kind of adopt, or how was that as an kind of as an experience for you as someone? I know you were kind of agnostic at first, kind of in New Mexico, but what was that like, starting to attend a Christian church and think through those things and experience a worship service that wasn't Mormon, because it's quite different?
Yeah, it was quite different, but in a lot of ways, I think the Lutheran traditional service that my wife's family attended was a fairly easy transition for me, because it's not the live music and all of that. It's just the hymns and things like the Mormon church. So I think that helped me a lot in my transition. It's funny because I would take communion with them, but I was always taking the grape juice instead of the wine because I grew up Mormon. I really don't like the taste of alcohol. I just never. I still to this day, I'll drink socially, but I really don't drink for the pleasure of it. Really, don't like the taste. I just never developed the taste for it. But yeah, to this day, I'll still grab the grape juice, and so and it tastes better than the water. So yeah, does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah. Any follow-ups for Dan before we throw that same question to Briana?
So just curious, do you still attend a Lutheran church, or what church do you attend now?
So with the pandemic, we started going to a rock and roll church. It's a Lutheran church, but it's very contemporary. It might be a sister church to the one you were attending, Michael. Because they've got the lights. It's kind of, they've got car parts up on the wall with the cross painted on the car parts and things like that. It's just a very, very cool church. The lead pastor and the pastor that I don't know what you call him, but they've got two pastors there, and they're just all tatted up, sleeves of tattoos, but they're really good guys. And Pastor Luke at the previous church I was going to, it was called Prince of Peace. He left and went back to his church back in, I believe, Nebraska. And so the pastor that came in after him just didn't have the same, it just wasn't the same. They had like an older gentleman that came in, and it didn't hit me the same way. And so we bounced around to several different churches around the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We even tried a Methodist church at one point. And we landed at this church. It's called Soul Thirst in the colony, and two great pastors, and they speak to me. They talk about brisket, and they talk about queso, and that's all I need to hear.
Sounds like my kind of place. How do I sign up for that?
So Briana, how about you? Kind of when in your transition did you start attending a Christian church? What was that like to do that for the first time?
So for a while there, I didn't know what church to go to. So I started watching some of the sermons online first with the Apologia Church. That was some of my first kind of church experiences, but it wasn't really going to church. But then I got connected online with some people on the ex-Mormon Christians group. And Carrie, she kind of helped me. This lady named Carrie, she lived nearby at the time, and she's like, "What? I need to take you to church." And she brought me to Calvary Chapel. So I got to experience that for the first time. It's like this little, like kind of like a mega church, but they teach expository chapters, like each chapter and verse by verse. And that experience was kind of shocking. I remember going to the service, and they had music. It was really loud. It was very big, totally different environment. And I just sat down, and I was just kind of like taking it all in. And I'm like, I don't know what to do. And she was kind of funny because she was kind of standing there, and she was like worshiping like her heart out. And she was like with her hands up and kind of like dancing to the music and singing. And it was so different. But it also, I felt like these people, like they felt like more free. Like in the Mormon church during sacrament meeting, you had to be quiet and like reverent and like kind of stiff. And there they were free to worship, like just open their hearts out. And I really liked that. Going there is totally different, but it was awesome.
What about that? What about that like Pentecostal church you went and visited?
Yeah, that was the first church I visited on my own. After doing some research online, I'm like, I'll try this one church, and it ended up kind of being a little freaky for me. It was in the evening, and they had like this kind of like what would you call it? Like the preacher was up there, and he was like calling out to the crowd, and he's like, he was like sensing like whatever illness in this person in their name. And then he was like, I'm going to bless you and pour the Holy Spirit on you. And people were praying around him. And like at one point too, like they had everybody like kind of whispering and praying, and like you could hear a bunch of voices all around you. It was really interesting, but it kind of put me off a little bit. But it was good.
At least they didn't hit you or anything.
No.
You could have ended up in like one of those snake churches. That would have been a fun church to go to first as an ex-Mormon.
I went to an interesting church like that too. My father-in-law, he plays guitar, and he was playing in a lot of church bands. And one of the guys he was playing with was like, hey, I got invited to play at this church, and he needs a lead guitar. We need a lead guitarist to help play. And so we went to this church. You know, the whole family went. This is before me and Lauren had kids. And so it was me, my mother-in-law, and my wife. And we pull into this address. You know, we'd never heard of it before. It was just a Joe's church. And it's kind of like an abandoned strip mall. And some of the businesses had like boarded up windows and things like that. And so we were just like, okay, what's going on here? So we go in one of the businesses. It was a church, and it was the only thing in the whole strip center that was open. And so we go in there, and it was similar to that. We went through the whole service, and it was semi-normal. You know, it wasn't real normal. And then at the end of the service, you know, then everybody started sticking out their tongues. Some people were like talking in tongues. Some lady was crawling up the middle of the aisle, and I was like, okay, let's go. But yeah, it wasn't anything that we were like, okay, we're going to start attending this church. It was just like they needed a guitar player, and that was the sole reason why we were there. But yeah, Larry didn't go play there again. My father-in-law.
I was going to point out earlier when it sounded like your churches are a lot more exciting than mine. It's like, if you've ever attended, like in most Mormon churches, there's kind of like the steady background noise of kids and ruffling and, people eating Cheetos or whatever. But it's like, you guys would probably feel really uncomfortable in my church because we have like a cry room, and we don't keep the babies in the actual worship, in the sanctuary. So it's like sometimes you can like hear a pin drop in there. So it's like sometimes when I reach in my pocket to get a tissue, I'm like, careful, don't do it. It's like Mission Impossible. You don't want to set any alarms off. They call Calvinists the frozen chosen for a reason. So just keep that in mind if you ever come visit.
Do they keep the air down really low there too, or frozen chosen?
Good one. So in any of these churches that you've visited after your transition out of the LDS church, did you ever encounter any kind of legalism or legalistic tendencies? And if you did, how did you handle that? So Dan, sounds like no. How about you, Briana?
No, I did not really experience any of that going to any of the churches, but I do see it more online with some of the Christians on the forums. But that's it that I've personally experienced.
It is kind of funny interacting with a lot of Christians on Facebook or discussion groups because they could probably be the nicest people you'd ever know. But as soon as you bring up the topic of baptism or gifts of the Spirit, it's like, the gloves are off and, they just turn into wildebeests. So, but, like you talk to them in person and they're cool people. So, yeah, I think the internet just engenders a kind of more conflict, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I've been seeing a lot of it recently too, like, especially with the election, both sides just kind of like, you're not a real Christian if you vote for so-and-so. And I'm just like, that's kind of ridiculous. And then, Halloween came and there's all these posts online, like false Christians are the ones, celebrating on Halloween and everything. And I'm just like, it kind of puts me off. And I think it's because of my Mormon background and all the legalism there, but I'm just like, okay, that's a false dichotomy. Cause I'm like, even if that's true, even if it's wrong to celebrate Halloween, like there's not just those two camps. Like there should still at least be a third camp, which is, people who aren't as sanctified yet or haven't done their research. But I'm just like, oh no, they're automatically, fake Christians. And that's one of the things that just gets to me the most. And it's just that judgmental background that we came from. And every time I see it, it just makes me want to shut down immediately. Like I have no tolerance threshold for it at all. I mean, I don't know if you guys are better at dealing with it than I am, but it's just very hard for me and very triggering for me whenever I see it.
Yeah, I struggle with it a bit. I think mostly I've just learned to kind of turn it off. You know what I mean? Because early on, I probably would have said something, if I saw it going on like in a Facebook group where I was involved. But I realized it just a lot of times just leads to arguments. And it is one of those things where it's like, okay, do I start arguing with this Christian in a Facebook group where there might be Latter-day Saints who are going to use that as evidence that we're not unified and that kind of thing. So I just kind of let it go most times. But my experience with legalism in church it was really refreshing actually, because I remember one of the first. So I think I talked about how our church, when we started attending, was going through a transition from one lead pastor to a new lead pastor, and they were co-preaching through a series on Ephesians at the time that we started attending. And then, at the end of that co-preaching series, there was like a special service where they actually made the transition from one pastor to the other. And the pastor who was retiring, he had been there for, like 30 years. And the new pastor coming in was a younger guy. He had been an associate pastor at a pretty large mega church in Louisville, Kentucky. Bob Russell pastored that church, Southeast Christian. It's one of the largest churches in the country. And so he comes from that background, and he came in and, he didn't change everything right away. But there were changes that were taking place. And one of them was a transition in music. And he preached a sermon on legalism. I remember it was probably within the first 8 weeks that we had started going there. And it was really refreshing to hear a pastor, preach a sermon and kind of talk about the Pharisees and say, as Christians, we have to be careful not to be legalistic about our faith, in the way that the Pharisees were. But at the same time, as Christians, we have to be careful not to be overly critical of the Pharisees, because they were religious people. They were faithful, devout people, following, God as they knew how. And it was a really interesting experience for me, because I hadn't heard a message anything like that within the LDS Church, where the message was clearly be careful about judgmentalism and legalism. And I remember one of the changes that they made is to the worship music. They transitioned from a kind of like a more traditional worship music with a choir, backing choir, to more of like the contemporary Christian rock and roll style. And I kind of liked that. And they started doing worship nights, like if there was a fifth Sunday, the like Thursday before, there would be a worship night that you would just go, and there really wouldn't be a message or anything. It would just be worship. And I attended a few of those. We attended a few of those, and there was one that I missed. And I remember, I wished I hadn't missed it, because afterwards, apparently, a young teenager got really into the worship music and got like more into it than just like raising his hand. He started dancing in the aisle. And I remember it was kind of the talk of the church for a while, because it was something that they hadn't really seen before. And so there were people who were like, maybe you shouldn't do that. And there were other people who were like, no, he's worshiping, he's connecting with God. It was kind of an interesting conversation to witness as a post LDS person. So, but yeah, I talk about that a little bit, because there you can see there's a little tension there between legalism, right? Even with regards to that teenage boy as he's trying to worship, and the whole idea of grace and not being so judgmental. So
I had kind of a quick follow-up question to that too, is we've talked about in previous episodes how the LDS, one of the main, I don't know how better to say it, selling points of the Latter-day Saint Church is that they claim a special authority that goes back to the apostles and to Jesus, and that they're the only true and living church upon the face of the earth. So in these Christian churches that you attended, did they say our church is the only true and living church upon the face of the earth? Or how did your churches view other churches?
Yeah, I'll go first because it's quick. One of the axioms of the American Restoration movement is, we're Christians only. We're not the only Christians. And so, yeah, that attitude, that idea that it's us or nobody else. And that's not to say that there aren't people within our movement that do go there. But at least within the independent Christian churches of Christ branch, it's pretty not like that at all. So.
How about you, Briana?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. So did the churches you have attended, the Christian churches you attended, did they ever say any kind of language like we're the only true church, or did they have, accepting views of other churches, other Christian churches?
Yeah, they never said anything about like being the only true church or anything like that, but they would mention like having a distinction between Christianity and like false Christianity, or stuff like that. But
can I add something to that too? Because she and I, we go to the same church. We've been to a couple of the same churches now. But But it's interesting because, when you're Mormon, you think that all these Protestant churches, all they do is rag on Mormonism, at least once a month. And I can honestly say I've been out 4 years now, and I've yet to see that happen, even one time. Now, our pastor is pretty vocal. He does tell us all to be very careful, and he says that there is a lot of apostasy in Christianity, and there's a lot of people who don't take the Bible seriously, and they're not teaching, biblical truth, and it's something that we have to really look out for. So he does say that, and he's also spoken out against Calvinism twice in his sermon, but I've never heard him say anything about Mormonism or say anything about the other churches aren't Christian, or even, we know he feels strongly against Calvinism, but he's never said that Calvinists aren't our brothers and sisters in Christ, which, as Latter-day Saints, that's exactly what I would have expected him to say, because I thought Christianity was more divided, and it really isn't. It's divided on some theological points, but even within that division, there's still unity. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, a lot of the times they'll acknowledge the differences, but still accept the main essential stuff. That's what's important.
Yeah, thank you. How about you, Dan?
Yeah, within the Mormon church, that's the only time I've really experienced any church saying, hey, we're the one and only true church. It's funny you mentioned that about being Mormon. You think that all the other churches are talking about you. Yeah, it's very rare. I think in all the years I've been attending Lutheran churches and other churches, I think I've only heard the pastor mention Mormonism one time, and it was really he was talking about false prophets and having other doctrine outside of the Bible, and you mentioned being triggered. That triggered me a little bit. He was talking about potentially where these people may go. They may be going to hell because they're believing in something that's not part of the Bible. And so that kind of bothered me a little bit, and it kind of triggered me to get kind of upset. I'm like, these are good people. I know a lot of really good Mormons. They do a lot of good things. And you're telling me that they're going to go to hell because they believe in the Book of Mormon. And I think one of you guys' guests you guys had on, he kind of touched on that a little bit, and he asked all of you guys if you thought he was going to be going to hell. Oh, it was the Mormon guy,
Our Radio Free Mormon.
Yes.
Oh, Radio Free Mormon. That's right. Yep.
Yeah. RFM. And so I really thought that was interesting, because I remember a conversation with Pastor Luke about that. My in-laws, they were transferring their membership over to this church, the Prince of Peace Church, and they were asking me, well, do you want to become a Lutheran? And we got into the conversation about my family and potentially them going to hell. And I remember just walking away from that conversation so mad, because I'm like, who are you to judge anybody? I really appreciated you guys' episode on that, by the way, because I never really came to a good resolution with that when you guys talked about that specifically. So anyway, I'm getting off track here.
No, that's good.
No, you're good.
Cut that whole part out.
Hey, Michael and Briana, I'm kind of envisioning like a new song. So if you two can get to work on it, like you know Carly Simon's song "You're So Vain."
Yep.
So it's something like that. Like, you're so vain, you probably think this sermon is about you.
Oh my gosh, we should do it. We'll have it by the next episode.
Like that.
It can be our new intro.
That's great. Yeah. So, okay. How should we move on from here? Well, I just wanted to chip in and say that, yeah, basically, I'm kind of in the same position you were in, Dan. Is that I've heard my pastors in the past 3 years I've been in my church. They've mentioned Joseph Smith, but usually it's only in a list of other people who have started religions, like Charles Taze Russell, who started Jehovah's Witnesses, Mary Baker Eddy, who started Christian Scientists, right? And then Ellen G. White, although she's kind of on the border. Some people are, they have different opinions on Seventh-day Adventism, whether it's Christian or whether it's not. But so it wasn't like he made a sermon about Mormonism. He just kind of mentioned, here are people who've started their own religions because they didn't like the way other people taught the Bible, so they wanted their own spin on things, kind of a thing. So, yeah, I've never heard a sermon from him. Of course, we're in New York State, too. There's not a whole lot of Mormons here anyway, so I don't know why he would make a whole sermon about Mormons. Most of my church hasn't even met a Mormon before until they met me. So, yeah, so moving on, let's talk about how your family handled the news that you were no longer going to be attending the LDS church, and either that you were just leaving the church or wanted to attend another church. So, Briana, would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. At the time when I left, I lived with my mom and two of my other siblings. I had a sibling that moved to Utah. And I think she got married like that year when I left Mormonism. So it was like right before. But yeah, so when I opened up to my mom about it, she was really shocked and she didn't know what to say. I'd kind of tried to tell her a little bit like what my testimony was. I told her that I believe in Jesus, but I do not believe in the Mormon church, and just kind of try to keep it short. But I remember like that day I was in my room and I could hear my mom crying, and she was just, I think she was under a lot of distress too, because I was the oldest of my family. I was the most faithful of all my siblings. And I was also her best friend too. And she kind of felt like, she had lost her marriage and now she's losing her daughter. And I remember my sister Topanga, she had reached out to me, and they told me that they still loved me, and that they weren't going to stop loving me. They would want me to come back, but they were very respectful. I didn't really tell a lot of people about it. It just kind of happened. I told my bishop. I sent him an email. I think the week before I stopped attending, I told him I need to be removed from my calling because I will not be coming back to church. And he told me that he was sad for me, but he understood, he had left the church too at one point earlier on. So he kind of understood that, but, people most people just kind of stayed quiet about it. And earlier on with my relationship with my mom, it was kind of rough too, because we started getting into arguments a little bit. But that was quickly resolved. It's just, I had to go through a grief period, and she was going through a grief period too. And we kind of needed to take some time apart so that we could reconnect on better terms.
So would you say today it's a lot better than you're a lot more, those conflicts are kind of resolved more today than they were at the beginning?
Yes, they were. Absolutely.
And plus, sorry, go ahead, please.
Sorry. You definitely have to go through that grief period, and you have to kind of distance yourself from, because it's very close to home. and when you're going through that, it can hurt relationships if you don't go through that first. Like you're grieving and transitioning and all of that.
Yeah, I kind of likened. So when my parents divorced when I was about 12, and I felt like leaving the LDS Church felt kind of like a divorce, where your whole life, all of your energy, like I spent 2 years in that church thinking that was helping people, thinking it was helping me. And then you kind of realize all that time, all that money, all that effort was kind of wasted, and it was all for nothing. And now you're just kind of by yourself. You don't have that social network connecting you anymore. You're kind of on your own. So that's why I don't know. I felt like I was going through a divorce, and that's why I took time not to jump into another church, because I was like, I don't want to rebound church, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to just jump into the next church, without really knowing what I'm getting myself into. Did you have kind of similar feelings like that?
Oh yeah. It took some time for me to kind of have the courage to and the emotional ability to move forward. But it's very important to get connected with some good people. Being in the online groups was very helpful during that time, especially because that's when you're most vulnerable.
We were actually talking a little bit today, me and Briana, about when you leave the church, there's kind of this religious fatigue. I don't know if you guys have gone through it, but it's just like, man, like I'm just, after like 32 years for me, it's just like, I'm just kind of tired, and I think that probably kept me from seriously committing to a church for a while too. Like we kind of go to these bigger churches where nobody would know we were there and we were invisible. And for a while, I mean, that was really probably what we needed, because I just didn't want to be asked to do anything or feel like I had any sort of commitment, because I'm just like, I was tired. I didn't want to jump into service again or anything. So that's kind of how it was for me anyway.
Yeah. Paul or Michael, did you have any more comments or questions before we ask Dan? Okay, Dan, would you like to share with us? How did your family handle telling them the news about not leaving the church? You talked a little bit about it, but maybe is there anything else you'd like to fill in the gaps?
Yeah, I think my mom and dad could kind of see the writing on the wall when I said I wasn't going to go to seminary in my senior year. And, I was making up credits, and so my senior year, I made up a bunch of credits my senior year to make sure that I could graduate. And seminary wasn't going to help that, because you go to this class, but you don't get any credit for it. So it's a lost credit there, basically. So I think they were okay with that piece, just knowing where I was with school. But until the day my mom died, I probably had a monthly conversation about the Book of Mormon being true. So I don't know that she ever let it go. My dad, I feel like my dad's, at least to my face anyway, I don't know if any conversations he's had to Paul about me, but because it sounds like he put some pressure on you to put some pressure on me. But I feel like because of his transition to Mormonism from outside of Mormonism, that he was more okay with it, more so as my mom, that would put a lot of pressure on me and have a lot of conversations. And a few months before her death, we started reading the Bible together, because, I wanted to make sure that she understood that that's the true gospel and where it should lie. And so we really wanted to build a spiritual relationship together. And I said, it won't be in the Book of Mormon, is what I told her. I said, I will read the Bible with you. And so that's what we did. We started with Genesis, and we made it through a few books before her passing. But yeah, she was kind of the driving force. I have one more sister that's pretty active, and she really didn't press me. And Paul said that he pressed me a little bit, but I really don't recall him pressing me more so. I think we had some really great conversations. And me not really believing that Christ was my Savior, I felt like some of those conversations, although they were based in Mormonism, they really helped me, I think, at least hold on to something instead of just letting it all go.
Did you have something to add, Michael? How about you, Paul? I think I saw Paul trying to say something earlier, and then you stopped yourself.
I think I was going to jump in and say that I don't think my dad was necessarily trying to put pressure on me to put pressure on Dan. Just just in our conversations about I had moved out here to Cincinnati area, and so when they would come visit or when I would talk to my dad on the phone, he would just kind of give me an update about how things were going with my siblings and the family, and because I'm away from home, so it was more just kind of like he would just mention in passing that you were struggling, or that he was trying to help you along by reading like Tennis Shoes Among the Nephites with you and that kind of stuff. But just kind of comments like that. I don't think he was trying to get me to put pressure on you. When I said I felt pressure, it was more just like as a big brother, who had served the mission. I was like, oh, I've got to make sure he does this too, So
I was just thinking too, like one of the big differences that's fascinating for me to hear about, both from you, Dan, and Briana, that I didn't experience was, leaving the church while I still lived at home. I already had some distance. And so for me, it was way easier. And I just imagine that it must have been a lot harder when you're like right there, like kind of in the lion's den with all that influence to kind of fly under the radar, or I guess not cause waves in those circumstances. I mean, do you agree with that?
Yeah. All right, you can go, Dan.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's definitely hard especially because you can't avoid it, and the more you try to avoid it, like the harder it gets. You just kind of have to rip off the Band-Aid and deal with it afterwards. I don't know. That's kind of how my experience went.
Yeah, it was definitely hard. I think, one of my sisters, I remember her calling me the devil one day because I didn't believe it, and I remember how much that hurt me, just personally, and I told her right there on the spot. I said, I really don't appreciate you calling me the devil, because I really am a good kid. I'm trying the best that I can. And she did come down and apologize to me after that, but I think some of that carries within Mormonism is that I came out when I moved to New Mexico. Like I felt like I was moving to a whole nother world because I had really not been outside of Utah for the most part. And so I had this perception of like non-Mormons almost being, not devil worshipers, but just not good Christians, I guess. And so I have this perception, and then the people that I met outside of Utah are just incredible people. And I'm just like, this whole perception of people outside of Mormonism just is not true. There's some really, really amazing people. And so a big problem for me leaving Mormonism was anybody that criticized somebody else, because it's all about being a good person following Christ's teachings, that it is what it's all about. And I think us as Christians in general, we argue with each other too much as far as who's going to heaven and who's going to hell, when we really should just be focused on those teachings. That's it. But yeah, it was rough. It was rough. I'd have to go pick up fast offerings on Sunday. Like I said, I was going through the motions, and some of the houses that would be on our list, they were no longer attending Mormon church, and we call them Jack Mormons. I don't know if that term exists outside of Utah or not, but we called them Jack Mormons. So we'd go knock on their house, and some of them weren't too pleasant to us, asking them for money. So I always wondered, why am I doing this? Why am I putting myself through this? One time I decided I'm not going to get up and do it this morning, and my friend's dad called me, and he was like, "Hey, are you going to come do fast offerings? We could really use your help." And I told him, "No, I'm sleeping." And he goes, "Would you'd rather sleep than do the Lord's work?" And I said, "Yes, today." And I hung up the phone. And his dad did not like me after that. He really he ended up being my scout leader later on, and we just did not get along after that that little interaction. But no, it was just that Sunday. I just wasn't feeling it.
Oh my goodness. I was thinking too, that is so wild, being called the devil by a family member. I think that happened to you once, Briana. I won't make you talk about it because I know that was just a heated moment. Mm-hmm. That's just crazy because, man, I'll tell you, I've been called a lot of mean things, but I don't think anybody's called me that yet. But I just don't understand how a Latter-day Saint can even call somebody in their own house that, because, in Mormonism, your home is a temple. So if you're going to call somebody that, then that's basically saying that your home isn't a temple at that point. So it's kind of, seeding that idea. And that's crazy to think about.
But don't you think that it's taken that seriously? And that's why you get comments like that? Like if the home is a temple and someone's not living the way you think they should within Mormonism, don't you think that those teachings kind of would lead to that conclusion?
I suppose so, but in Mormonism, like they say that Satan and his angels, they have no power to enter a temple or even a normal church building. So that's kind of saying that some outside force has taken away the holiness of your home and your forever family. And that, to me, that's just kind of, and maybe this is just me again leaning towards the Reformed position, but that's kind of giving all the strength to Satan instead of giving it to God. But that's just my opinion on it.
And I can see why families struggle so much. I was fortunate that half of my family, on my mom's side, they're not very religious. And my dad, he and his family are pretty strong Latter-day Saint, but my dad's pretty cool since he's kind of had a similar experience. Kind of, Dan, like what you were saying, your dad came from a non-LDS background, right? And then he converted. So my dad had kind of, hills and valleys in his faith. So, I think he was just happy to find out I was attending a church, that I hadn't abandoned religion altogether. But salvation in Christianity, it's basically seen as a relationship between you and Christ. Are you personally in Christ? Are you trusting him as your savior? Whereas in the LDS church, it's a family ordeal. You know, it's so focused on the family where you have to have a worthy priesthood holder as a father and a mother that's honoring her covenants also. And the children are sealed to them. And it's kind of it's like an all or nothing package kind of thing. So when someone wants to break off, it's like they're not just affecting themselves, they're affecting the whole family. And so I think it's normal. It's sad to see, but I think it just means that it's inevitable because Latter-day Saints take their religion so seriously. So on one hand, I see it as like kind of a good thing, because if they didn't take their religion seriously and they knew that you were going to have very serious consequences to your soul and they pretended like they didn't care, then you know what I mean? That would kind of show a lack of empathy or love on their part. But yeah, it is kind of sad to see that they're so caught up in this religion that is so focused on, we've all got to get through together. We've all got to do this. You also talked about sharing the gospel with your family. Do you have any other lessons you'd like to share with our listeners who are maybe struggling to do the same, struggling to share their faith transition with their families? Do you have any lessons you've learned that you'd like to share with them? So, Dan, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think just making sure that you anchor yourself in a church and some folks that you can trust, and just making sure that you don't waver in Christ, and you made the right decision. And there is going to be a lot of pressure. If you listen to some of the previous episodes, these guys talk about some of the social pieces, the there's family members, there's a whole social background that you're losing by leaving. And so just really making sure that you're rooted in that. And honestly, I really haven't pressured a lot of my own family. And actually, I blame your podcast, because now the Mormon missionaries are reaching out to me monthly. So, which they hadn't contacted me in years prior to your podcast. So thanks a lot, guys.
Hey, correlation is not causation, all right?
But yeah, I personally, if they ever reach out and ask me anything, I'll share, of course. But I really, it's really touchy. I think Paul would tell you, some of our family members will just completely shut down if you try to have a conversation with them at times. And we've had some breakthroughs with some of our family members where, they've actually opened up and talked to us. And so I think it's just making sure that you plant that seed and allow them to take that journey, take that that spiritual journey for themselves, because in some ways, the more you pressure them, the deeper they dig in. And that's really what I've found. And so I just try to plant as many seeds as I can. And eventually those trees are going to grow, and their spirit is going to grow in the right direction. I think God will lead them in the right direction eventually.
I really like how you said that we kind of need to be rooted in the gospel, because if our foundation is our social surroundings, our friends, it's such a huge shift when you leave the LDS church and you're trying to figure out where to go from there, that it's like your foundation is taken from under you. So you need to have something sure and strong to stand on, or else, I mean, we all have friends that have left the LDS faith, and many of them just reject religion altogether. They reject God, they reject faith, they become hypercritical of anything supernatural or faith related. And it's really sad, because sometimes, a lot of times they'll end up being good citizens, they'll end up being, it's not like they go and become criminals, but at the same time, you see, I don't know, at least I see sometimes people become very bitter and very hurt. And I understand that. I think we all understand that to a degree, but there's just so much, like, just because there's false religion doesn't mean there is not true religion. There's not true Christ and salvation. And it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater to just give it all up. So we've really got to be rooted in that when we share it with others, and we've really got to do it in love and with patience, like you said. And it's so like the LDS church is not just a church, it's their whole culture. It's their whole identity, their ancestry. Like they have, pioneers that go back generations a lot of times. And so it's like, you're rejecting the religion their ancestors have had. So it's really difficult. Paul or Michael, do you have anything to add to that before I ask Briana? Okay, Briana, would you like to share any lessons that you've had when, sharing your faith transition or trying to share the gospel with your family or friends?
Yeah, basically everything that Dan just said too. But on top of that, I don't know what to add to that. Just kind of go with the not to expect things to always go completely well, just to go with the expectation that it's not going to be easy. It's going to be very hard, and they may not respond the way you necessarily want, but it's normal to feel both afraid and for them to feel the way they might feel. Just give it some time. Just stay in touch with yourself and getting into the scriptures and understanding what you really believe before you even reach out to anybody or to try to teach them. I know that I made some mistakes initially. I get really fired up, and especially when you leave and you find out the truth, you get really fired up and you just want to go in there and save them, but it can be counterproductive when you do that, because then it just instills in them that you're just this angry person and just wanting to show them what's right instead of just loving them. So yeah, I think that's really important. It's just to love them, and don't be so hard on yourself either. Just give it some time.
Yeah, like Dan was saying, plant those seeds and kind of leave it to God to nourish those seeds. That's what's really helped me too, coming to Christianity, is as a missionary, I felt like, as an LDS missionary, I felt like my salvation was on the line and the salvation of everybody I talked to was on the line. So I had to say all the right words. I was constantly paranoid that I was going to send all these people to outer darkness and all that. So it was up to me to say just the right thing to get them to become Latter-day Saint. And of course, I went to Europe. Paul he can relate to that. It's not easy over there. There's a lot of people that don't like religion, but now knowing that God's in control and we're just called to be faithful and to preach the gospel, that's such a huge weight off my shoulders. It's not up to me to save anybody. It's up to Christ. I think that's kind of what you were saying, Briana, is that just leaving it to God. Yeah. Thank you for sharing all that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts too, just to piggyback of all three of you, said things I really liked just now. Dan, I like how you said to get rooted in the gospel, because, you come out and people want to ask you all these questions immediately. And from my experience, I didn't even know how to articulate my reasons for leaving yet. I was still trying to figure it out myself, what brought me to this point. And then the more I tried to explain it without being ready, I feel like, now I look back at it and I'm like, oh, if only I'd known how to explain things the way I do now. And so I feel like, it's easy to kind of go with what you said, Matthew. It's easy to, and Briana, it's easy to panic sort of as a new Christian too, and be like, oh my goodness, my whole family is still stuck there. And if I don't do something right now and convince them today to leave the church, they're going to have an eternity of suffering. And I think we just need to calm down a little bit. And I'm not saying not try to reach our family members, but I'm saying to trust God a little bit, like what you're saying, Matthew, and realize that it's not us saying the magic words. that God's got things under control. God's not up there on his throne fretting and crying and panicking. And we don't need to be doing that either. And I think it is good to have discussions with family members, but I think what's more important, especially early on, like you said, Briana, is to love your family. And a lot of ex-Mormons, they try to talk to their families and then it gets heated and then they have no relationship with their families anymore. And then there's just fingers kind of pointed like, well, it's them. They don't want to talk to me, but it's kind of both sides to a degree. And it's really important when we leave, I think, to show our families that we love them, to reach out to our family members, just give them a call and just say, hey, how are things going in your life right now? Just continue to be there for them. And if you can't prove something doctrinally, I mean, Mormons care so much about orthopraxy and correct practice, just living a life that they can't point at you and say, well, you left because you wanted to sin. But actually having that relationship with Christ and just, living a Christian life in and of itself is something that, they're going to take notice of. So that's what I'd say.
I do want to mention, you can't, not everybody is going to be receptive. And some people, even no matter how good you behave or love on them, some relationships aren't going to always be fixed. And that's also something that you're going to have to kind of deal with, I guess, and realizing too that, maybe it wasn't as strong of a relationship as it was, but the most important thing is to just do your best to love them, no matter what.
Yeah, and I think another thing to add to that, and we're not trying to take over the podcast here, but just to realize that a lot of times when that does happen and when there's alienation, it isn't personal. It is these members of the church just doing what they think they have to do, and it's the church. It's not because of you.
Yeah. I definitely made mistakes in trying to reach out to family. Initially when we left, I've talked about my detour through kind of like Sunstone and Dialogue Mormonism and through Mormon Stories, kind of more liberal type Mormon related podcasts and those types of things. And a lot of people who kind of go that route and they deconstruct Mormonism, the tendency is to want to, write a long letter to their family or whoever they're connected with within Mormonism and prove everything wrong. You got like CES letter and then just, all these other kinds of letters that people have written to their spouse or to their bishop or whoever, and it's very focused on trying to deconstruct Mormonism for them. And when we left, I really didn't want to do that. And so I just kind of drafted a quick email to the family to let them know, hey, we're leaving. We don't think you're horrible people. We've got to do this for us. We've got to find relationship with Christ. And I remember one of my sisters had a reaction to it that I didn't expect, because I really tried to be, and Dan, you can tell me if I was successful, but I really tried to be accommodating in my email to just say, hey, we're leaving and it's for us. And, we just want you to know, because we love you, that this is going on with us. And one of my sisters reached out and was like, okay, never talk to me about religion again. And, that it surprised me and it hurt me. And I had to respect that wish, that she expressed to me. And so I didn't for a long time. And then, she started deconstructing Mormonism and then reached out to me and apologized for asking me not to talk to her about religion. And so then I And I'm like, all right, I've got a green light. And I jumped right in and started preaching. And she was like, that, don't want it, you know? And so, you know, it's tough, you know, mistakes are made. And, you know, I have to tread lightly with my siblings and try to do the best that I can. I've had really good conversations with all of them, and I've had tough conversations with all of them. So it's, you know, like Briana was saying, you have to realize that the relationships are going to be tough because of this. And you just have to do your best to love your family. And Michael, you touched on it too. That's really the most important part, right? Because I've had, you know, if you're just angry, and you're not grounded, like in the gospel, like Danny said, you know, if you're just angry, then Latter-day Saints won't want to hear what you have to say, you know. And if you're just deconstructing Mormonism for them, and you're not giving them the gospel in an effective way, both by preaching and through your life, then, you know, I've had Latter-day Saints tell me, you know, why would I listen to you? You don't have anything better to offer me, you know. And that's when I've heard that or been told that by Latter-day Saints, it really is a moment where you have to take a step back and say, whoa, you know, I've got to change up my approach here, because this isn't effective. So.
Yeah, I wanted to just add to, whenever we share the gospel with friends or family that are LDS or otherwise, the passage that always comes to mind is 1 Peter 3. So he's speaking about suffering for righteousness' sake. And in verse 14, he says, "But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame." So no matter how they react to the message, we can't go against what Christ has ordered us to do, to be patient, respectful, loving. We can be bold, of course, but I think just yelling at somebody that they're going to hell is probably not the best way to do it. But yeah, we always need to honor Christ in our heart first, and to honor him, and to always be ready to defend the faith. So I think I just wanted to share that really quickly. So a lot of Latter-day Saints, when they leave the church, kind of talking about this topic of apologetics, sharing the gospel, a lot of them, as soon as they leave the church, they want to start up their own ministry, either apologetics or, like, you know, outreach kind of ministry. Did you ever consider doing that? Do you think that's a good idea, or why not? So Dan, how about you go first?
You know, my mother-in-law, she suggested that to the pastor, if we had any ex-Mormons that came into the church, if I would be willing to kind of befriend them. And at the time, I was not interested in that. I was going to my own spiritual battle. And so I really wasn't interested in trying to help somebody else if I can't even help myself. And so I think where I'm at now, I definitely would be willing to help somebody along that path. But yeah, I have been approached about it, but no, I haven't done it or been involved in one yet.
Yeah, awesome. How about you, Briana?
Yeah, no, I didn't really feel that pull to really get into ministry, but I do kind of understand why some people might, because, you know, when you're new out and you have this testimony, you're on fire. And I was starting to go down that road a little bit with my family, and had to quickly realize that that's dangerous. And it's very important to first be grounded in several areas. You need to be involved in a church, have some like pastoral guidance, and like to just study the gospel more and the scriptures, and understanding things on a deeper level. Because if you don't, then you run the risk of developing heretical, I guess, like things, and you could lead other people down a path that you don't want them to go down. There's a certain level of maturity that you have to reach, I think, before you could start a ministry or getting involved in that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I can think of, maybe you all know who I'm talking about, but I can think of one major figure who left Mormonism and started a ministry and has since left Mormonism and says that he now follows Judaism, rabbinical Judaism. And it was, I don't think he was very well grounded in the New Testament. I think he took a lot of the hypercritical ideas that he used to deconstruct the Book of Mormon and started doing that with the Bible, but in such a way that I don't think he quite grasped the foundations of the New Testament and how it was a fulfillment of the Old Testament. And so, yeah, it's a really risky thing, I think, to go in. It's one thing to just witness to people and say, I believe in Jesus, and share your experience. But it's another thing to like go into a full-time ministry where, especially if that's like becomes your job or you go around and give, seminars or whatever, to workshops to people to teach them how to witness to Mormons, because it's not only the fact that you might not be well grounded in the doctrine, but if there's a lot of notoriety and a lot of attention you can get as a former Latter-day Saint who's now Christian, and that attention and that fame can kind of really go to your head and get to your ego. So if you're not grounded in doctrine and in Christ, that's a really huge temptation that I know for myself, that would be way too much for me to handle. If I was suddenly being asked to talk to crowds of thousands of people and, tell them about my story and they're hanging on my every word, that's just way too much to handle. And, I think you need to really be grounded first before you do any of that. Paul or Michael, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I totally get what you're saying about the temptation to soak up that notoriety, right? I never spoke to groups of thousands, but at church there was one of the Bible study fellowships for one of their series decided to study through the kingdom of the cults, just so that they would have an idea of what do kind of non-orthodox groups teach and believe, so that if they ever were to interact with them, they would understand it. And the guy who was leading that class knew that I was an ex-Mormon, so he invited me to come in and speak to the class. And there's definitely this, suddenly I'm an authority here simply because I'm an ex-Mormon, right? But I was really new in the Christian faith at that time. And then I remember one other time sitting with some Christian friends in one of their homes, and my friend mentioned that, hey, Paul here is a ex-Mormon. And of course, then everybody has a lot of questions. It's a dinner party and everybody just wants to know all kinds of stuff. And, so they're asking the questions and you're explaining the differences. And, there are major theological differences, and you can get into ground where it really enthralls Christians, because they're like, whoa, I didn't realize they believed that, kind of stuff. And there is that temptation to be like, oh man, like you were saying, they're hanging on my every word. Right. And I remember, kind of thinking through that experience and thinking, that's not really what I want. And I almost went to that place of wanting to defend, like, oh, it's not as strange as you're thinking kind of thing. You know what I mean? But I remember thinking through that and thinking, I really need to get really need to get grounded. And that's when I kind of started to consider going to a Christian seminary, and I didn't really have aims of going into ministry necessarily, but I wanted to learn. I wanted to study. I wanted to grow in the faith, and really get grounded in the Bible and in God's word, and understanding Christian history. And so I got registered to go to the seminary, and the advisor who I was assigned reached out to me and said, "Hey, let's meet for lunch." And we got together and, talked about my background. And he asked me, are you going to go into ministry? What are you thinking your ministry goals would be? Because, if you're going to Christian seminary, that's generally what the students are thinking. They're going to get into ministry in some way. And of course, I didn't really have any thoughts in that regard. I was really just, hey, this is for me to get grounded. And I think it kind of caught him off guard, but he was like, yeah, that's, with your background, that's probably a good idea, and maybe, through this process, you'll find what your ministry will be. And really this podcast is it. This is where I've landed for now, with ministry. But yeah, it is important to get grounded. You see a lot of people will jump right into trying to reach Latter-day Saints, and there's still, like Briana was saying, there's a lot to process through and a lot to kind of deconstruct and then reconstruct, right, in terms of what puzzle pieces from what I had before fit the Christian worldview, which ones don't, what does the resulting structure look like when you actually build it rightly on Jesus Christ as the foundation. And if you don't have that grounding, if you don't take the time to do that, you do end up being, I think, a lot of times a tinkling cymbal, right? You're just angry, and you just push people away. And like Briana also noted, you can lead people down paths that are not in line with God's word. So it's important to get grounded.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Paul. Yeah, I really wanted to point out too that I really loved how Briana had pointed out that you need to be in a body of believers somewhere and submitting to solid biblical preachers who have authority, not to be authoritarian over you, but to be kind of like shepherds, to make sure that you are being taught right, that there are certain things that you're not, that you're being fed spiritually. And because there are a lot of ministries out there where they are, I guess you could say paraministries or ministries that are not associated with the church. They're kind of like their own thing. And they're not, sometimes you'll ask them, they're not part of a church, or they'll bounce from church to church. And so what's to stop them from teaching whatever they want? They could teach whatever they want and they would have no repercussions. There's no accountability, and that's scary. But when you're dialed in, when you're tied to a church that is solid and you have solid preachers and they're aware of your ministry and what you're doing, and they view your content and they're making sure that everything is okay, then there's accountability there. And before, so I was kind of like the third wheel or the fourth wheel or fifth wheel, whatever the colloquial phrase is, because Paul and Michael had kind of come up with the idea for this podcast, and they were trying to find a third. And they're like, I don't know, there's this crazy Calvinist guy. I don't know. He might be one of those like cage stagers. I'm not sure. He might be a little bit crazy. But then they approached me and I was like, okay, well, I think I remember saying, I'll get back to you on it. Let me think about it. And I told my pastors about this project that we wanted to do, because that was one thing that was really on the front of my mind. Is I was like, yeah, I've only been out of the church 2 years. I feel like I've learned a lot, but at the same time, I don't want to go off the rails. I don't want to lead anybody else off the rails. And so I talked to them about it and made sure it was okay with them. And they said they really loved the idea. They supported me, and they've listened to some of the podcasts. They haven't listened to all of them, but they've listened to some, and they've really appreciated what we're trying to do. We're trying to, reach Latter-day Saints who may be questioning, and share with them our faith journey. So I really appreciate their support. And, occasionally they'll pray for the podcast at our church. I was the person of the week for our prayer meeting this week. So I asked for prayers to reach more people, that the podcast would God could use it as an instrument to bringing people to him. So it's really great to have not just us working on it, but to have other believers praying to God that it would be effective and that it would be, it'd have a wide audience, a wide reach. So there's just a lot of benefit, and I think it's really necessary to just be part of a church at all. Unfortunately, a lot of times people will just say, especially former Latter-day Saints, they'll say, well, I have Jesus, that's all I need. I don't need a church, I just have my Bible. And, that's true. You don't need a church to be saved, but at the same time, it's like, okay, you can have a plant and you can give it a couple drops of water every couple months, just enough to keep it alive. But is that really going to make the plant as big and as healthy and as lively as it could be? So you're really missing out on a lot if you're not joining yourself to a church. Sorry, that's my little PSA for listeners who are on the fence about that.
I wanted to jump in here too, because this is a subject that I feel really passionately about. I left the church, and for me, it just felt really natural to kind of jump onto the debate groups and immediately start debating Latter-day Saints, because I'm like, well, I'm already an apologist, so this is just totally natural for me to not take a break and just immediately kind of go into this. And Matthew, when you were talking about somebody who jumped into ministry and left the faith, 3 other names just popped into my head immediately, like 3 other examples that I can just think of. And I can't think of a single time where it's worked out positively for a Latter-day Saint who just immediately jumps into ministry. And I saw all of those examples, and I kind of backed off for a while. And then I kind of felt like I should jump back in. And I asked my mentor, and what he asked me was if I still had animosity towards the church. And I said that I didn't. And he said that he thought I was ready. But in retrospect, I think I was only about halfway there at that point. I think kind of losing the animosity is a big key step before you can jump in there. But one of the other problems that I discovered that I had, and it really took the Spirit telling me that this was a problem that I had, because I didn't recognize it as a problem. But I really seemed to like the praise of man more than I should. And, I was writing articles about Mormonism, and people were like, oh, that's brilliant, you're a genius. And I would just love hearing stuff like that. And then we started the podcast, and I'm just like, yeah, I'm getting my name out there, and this is great. And the Spirit just really convicted me and was like, you should care more about God's glory. And oh my gosh, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I remember I came home and told Briana about it, and I couldn't even look her in the eyes that night when I came home, because I just been so self-absorbed, and yeah, it's just totally kind of changed my viewpoint on everything that I do now. And it's just like, yeah, I think that I have the right motivation now, because I do just want to glorify God and to help anybody who might be listening to this podcast. But there was definitely a pride factor going on there. And one of the big things that I realized was I hit this point where I felt like I could debate Latter-day Saints really well. And I had a lot of these articles out and things, but then there'd been this opportunity cost where I think I'd been out maybe 2 years, and I'm like, where's my sanctification? How has my relationship with Christ grown in this time? And I had to step back and say, it hasn't. It really hasn't. And I need to step away from this, because this is a distraction, and I need to build that relationship with God, and I need to get into the Bible, and I need to focus on Christ right now. And so I did. I took that break. It was actually right when I got married. We took a year. I took a year off, and at first it was really hard. I'm just like I couldn't get off of Facebook and stop debating Latter-day Saints, but I finally just got away from it. And that year was just so essential for me to actually just grow in my faith. And I would just say that to anybody who's an ex-Latter-day Saint who wants to jump right into ministry. I really advise against it.
Yeah, I remember that time and reaching out to you around that time about starting the podcast, because I was just kind of coming out of seminary and thinking, okay, where am I going with this ministry thing, and what's it going to look like? And I reached out to you, and I remember you telling me, I really need to take this time, and you explained why. And I remember thinking, yeah, that's really mature and really a good thing to be doing. And I was, happy to postpone and just keep planning, for the time when we would actually bring it to fruition. But I think that was a good move on your part.
I've got a question for you guys, if you don't mind. One thing that I struggled with in my transition to Christianity was that I felt like there was less there. Did you guys experience that at all? Leaving the Mormon church feeling like, okay, we no longer have the priesthood. There's not temples anymore. Well, I mean, depending on the church you're going to now, but did you guys have that feeling at all? In some of my deconstruction, that was some of the things I struggled with. I was like, okay, well, where's all the stuff about the afterlife in the Bible, and it wasn't as much as I felt like there was in Mormonism. And so I struggled with that a long time until I really got myself anchored within Christ and just gave myself to Christ. Did you guys experience that at all as well?
Yeah, for sure. One thing I really struggled with is like when I was still LDS and I was struggling, for my identity, or just feeling I have a lot of perfectionistic tendencies that also feed into my procrastination, which is a really bad combination because you don't want to start something because it's going to be terrible. So then you just wait until the last minute. And then you're like, I got 3 hours to do this homework assignment. I'm just going to just do it, even if it's garbage. So I really struggle with that. And so I struggled with like beating myself up a lot, not being good enough. But one thing that always gave me comfort was this idea that I'm a priesthood holder. I'm an elder in the church. I hold the Melchizedek priesthood. I'm not perfect, but I feel like I'm quote unquote worthy. And then like, being in the temple, I saw connections to that of like the priesthood in the Old Testament. And so like leaving that behind, I was like, well, so you mean I'm just a guy now? I just go to church and I just praise God, and like all the learning I've had is kind of like for nothing, and like all my experiences as a missionary, that was like, I'm just a normal dude now. That was really hard for me to deal with. Not so much the differences in doctrine, just because I felt like the Bible is so rich. When you really dive into it, there's so much you can learn. But I do see kind of what you mean in the sense of like less detail, I guess, like in the sense of there's not the different degrees of glory and there was no premortal existence, kind of shifting my ideas on that. But that didn't really bother me. I was like, well, if it's in the Bible, I'll believe it. But it was more personal identification of being like, oh, well, I mean, I'm a true believer now, I believe in Christ, but like, I don't know. I struggled with feeling quote unquote special, I guess. And I think that's one thing the LDS Church does is, in a sense, is make you feel like, you're so awesome. You're so special. You're different than everybody else. And I felt like I kind of lost that, but it really just took time to kind of shift that thinking around. It took time and to realize like, we're all believers in Christ, we're all part of the royal priesthood in a sense where we offer sacrifices of our time and our abilities and our faith to Christ. So in a sense, we're still priests, but yeah, so that was what I struggle with a lot.
Yeah, I don't know that I struggle with that, but I see that as kind of a comment that is given often when I'm having dialogue with Latter-day Saints is, the things that you mentioned, the priesthood, the temples, the kind of the anthropocentric, the human-centered kind of theology of, there's a sense that, if I were to leave Mormonism, I would lose this whole sense of my destiny and what I can become, right? There's definitely that as a sentiment. I don't think that I really struggled with it because of the way I left Mormonism, because of the way I kind of deconstructed through that liberal side of Mormonism. So some of the more orthodox theology and then practices like temple attendance kind of fell by the wayside several years before I left Mormonism. And so I kind of set that down before I started studying Christianity. And then when I did study Christianity and kind of get into the depth of Christian theology and the depth of the symbolism that's kind of woven throughout the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, it really kind of sparked an interest in me. And so I don't think I had that feeling, but I do get that from Latter-day Saints that I talk to, that they think that it's less than.
So I would say that sometimes less is more, though. And one of the things I really like is just that that phrase, "Be still and know that I am God." But there's definitely something about not being so busy and actually just sitting back and looking at God with awe and wonder and seeing all that he has done and resting in the Lord. And those are all concepts that were completely foreign to me as a Latter-day Saint. But I think there's a lot more in there. And I think, for a little while I was kind of going through that too, Dan, where it's just like, okay, like there's no boundaries here. A lot of the churches I was going to, like, there's no liturgy or anything. And it's just like, this just feels very shallow. And what I kind of found was some of the churches that I was trying out originally, they were kind of shallow because they weren't really teaching out of the Bible very much. Then maybe there'd be like a verse or two. And what I found kind of helped me was going to like a church where they do just focus on, one chapter of the Bible, and they just read through that and talk about what that means. And for me, having a little bit more scripture helped, and actually reading the scriptures. And but that's kind of my answer to that. It's just less is more. Do you have any thoughts on that, Briana?
No.
Yeah, appreciate you guys weighing in on that. I struggled with that a long time, and I was looking for all these answers in the Bible that Mormonism had that I didn't have anymore. And honestly, until I really just let go and made the determination that I'm going to give everything to Christ, I'm not in control, which is something that was instilled in me when I was growing up, is everything you do, you control your salvation. But that's not true until you really give it all up to Christ and know that you're his. You really don't feel it. And you guys hit on it. I know you guys have all in all of your transitions, you guys have talked about that, is when it just comes over you and you feel that there's nothing you can do, you're his now. That was huge for me. So, what other questions do you guys have? I don't want to take over your podcast.
Yeah, Paul and I'll leave. It'll just be you three guys. You can take over. We're going on a sabbatical. No, thank you guys for sharing that. I appreciate it. One thing that really helped me too is just realizing that when you read the Bible as a Latter-day Saint, I was always thinking about like, what is God promising me? Like, what is he going to give me? When you read the Bible and you find out that it's not about what God is doing for me, but it's about God It's about us glorifying God. It's about his plan of redemption. That changed a lot for me too. So do you guys have any advice for listeners that you haven't already given tonight? You know, like maybe people who are struggling with the transition period or post-transition, or who are afraid to dive in and, you know, make that decision to leave the LDS Church. Do you have any advice for them?
I have one thing that just comes to my mind, and that is two things. But it's natural to feel a little bit angry when you leave the Mormon Church. But I would just say don't unleash that on your LDS friends and family, and just keep in mind that, you know, the gift of grace is it's a really good gift, and when it boils down to it, we don't have anything to be angry or upset about. You know, we're very, very blessed, and that's something that I think we need to keep in mind as ex-Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, so just kind of one thing I'd like to kind of key in on. I've struggled a little bit with the title for this episode. We kind of set it for a while as, you know, advice for the post-Mormon baby Christian. And then I was thinking, well, maybe it will be advice for the post-Mormon new Christian. Maybe that'll be less offensive. But I think back about through my experience leaving the LDS Church, and Matthew, you kind of touched on it. You know, you have this idea that you're special because you hold the priesthood, right? And that kind of carried with me as I left and jumped right into a Christian church. I wanted to get involved right away because that's what I did, right? As a Latter-day Saint, you have your calling, you do it. And so I'm jumping in trying to find, okay, what's my calling here? And I had some really good mentors. The pastor who was the kind of in charge of the men's group at the church, he did kind of bring me in and give me opportunities to, you know, teach first from his outlines, and then, you know, work with me to develop an outline for a lesson of my own on a Wednesday night Bible study. And he reviewed that and gave me pointers, and, you know, he really did a good job mentoring me through that. But it helped me realize, you know, that, you know, it's okay to, as an ex-Latter-day Saint coming into Christianity, it's okay to view yourself as a baby Christian, because there are significant differences that you need to understand if you're going to be involved in preaching the gospel, the true gospel, to others. And so it is okay to allow yourself that period of time where you just learn and study and grow and allow the Holy Spirit to teach you. I kind of resisted against that because I thought, hey, I've been a Christian my entire life. You know, I've been living this. I just went on a mission to Europe. You know, I get this stuff, you know, and it didn't take me very long to realize, well, wait a minute, there's some things I really don't get that I need to really, really understand. So my advice would be, allow yourself to see yourself as a baby Christian, and don't think of that as offensive.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, I felt the same way. It was interesting that we each had different reactions when we left the LDS Church, how it sounded like from Briana and Michael that they wanted some breathing. They wanted some room to breathe and not have to worry about callings and things like that. Whereas, Paul, I'm kind of with you, where I got into the church and I felt like I was benched, you know? I'm like, you know what, come on, coach, let me in, you know? Put me up to bat. I want something to do. But then it really just took some...
Coach, I'm ready to play.
I'm ready. Yeah. So it does take humility, like humbling from the Spirit, I think, to realize you're not in a position quite yet to really do what you want to do. And it's going to take some time and some nurturing. you're so it's such a shaky time right after you leave the church and go into Christianity. Like you really need to understand, what do I believe? What does the Bible say? And how do I reach people? Because if you don't know those things and you're still struggling and you're trying to piecemeal gather information from like websites and apologetic sources and be like, I want to refute all their argumentation, I want to debate everybody, then that's like surefire, way for disaster. Dan and Briana, do you have anything to add to that question?
Dan, you want to go first?
My last advice would be that the social, if you're staying just for the social pieces, just know that every Christian church that I've gone to have had very strong family values, and that's something that you instill that comes from you, right? And so just know that you can create those new social ties within each church family that you find, and find one that works for you. But also don't be afraid to look at information. When growing up, they called it anti-Mormon doctrine, and not to read any anti-Mormon doctrine. Well, some of the things that the Book of Mormon claims, we have science that backs that up, such as DNA. When they go and look at the DNA of people of South America, it doesn't match what the Book of Mormon is saying they came from. So just know that. Obviously, be careful about what you go and look at, and be rooted in the Bible, and the gospel within the Bible. But don't be afraid to explore and look at what's out there.
Yeah, beautiful. Briana?
I honestly can't think of anything at the top of my head. But I'm just gonna piggyback off of everybody. Yes.
No, that's totally fine. Maybe is there something that you wish you knew at the beginning that you know now? Maybe some advice for your younger self.
Stay away from that Michael guy.
That is good advice.
Why are you laughing, Briana?
When you're marrying Dr. Pepper, you're gonna get get Mr. Pibb.
There is some. Well, so now that you kind of mentioned it, no. There.
I'll go continue. I'm very interested in hearing what you're going to say.
Well, before I met Michael, so there is some. Oh, now I don't even know what I was going to say. But when you're single and you're as a Christian, when I was brand new, I was able to spend more time kind of developing my own spirituality. And then for a moment there, once I got into a relationship, that kind of, it wasn't necessarily hindered, but it kind of slowed down a lot initially. But it can be very helpful too to have someone by your side who's also got that same grounding. And with me and Michael together, it took some time, but with us going to church together and having a partner to go, we're able to grow and learn together. So there's some challenges that can come when you're alone, but there's also some blessings and benefits to it too. So if you're feeling alone, like you aren't alone. But God is going to give you opportunities that you wouldn't have in whatever circumstance you find yourself in. I guess.
So the question that I'm going to ask that I shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway. Would you say that it's normally not a good idea to get in a relationship as a new Christian?
Probably, but I can't really say. For myself, I've been lucky for sure, but
because I've definitely felt some guilt. It's like that whole thing, like, oh, like she's a brand new, and I wasn't thinking like this, but in retrospect, I'm kind of like, it could be easily seen that I was thinking like this, like, oh, she's vulnerable, she's a new, ex-Mormon Christian, and then I just jumped right in there, and that's like picking somebody up at a funeral or something. Like, that's kind of crazy.
That's something I thought about too, because I struggled. Like when I was leaving the church, I was actually engaged to be married. You all know this, but so when I transitioned out, that relationship ended, and that was hard getting over that at the same time. And then I didn't go on a date for probably like 2 or 3 years or something like that after that. And so I tried to make the most of that time, really grounding myself in scripture, and it was funny because I got to a point where I felt like, like if God really wanted me to, I was praying a lot about it, and I was thinking, if God really wanted me to be single for a long time or, indefinitely, whatever, I could do it. I feel like I got to a point where I was stable enough that I didn't have that worry, that stress that Mormons have, like, oh my gosh, I got to get married. My salvation is tied to being married in the temple. I just got to get married. I kind of got over that. And then it's like a month later, I started dating my current girlfriend. So I don't know, God has kind of an interesting way of working things out, but yeah, I think that time, that 2 or 3 years where I just really tried to study the Bible and answered all my questions, like, what is baptism for the dead? Is that a real thing? What about life after death? Where do we go? Things like that. I think just grounding myself in all those things was really beneficial to me, and not having to worry about relationships at the same time. But to each their own. I wouldn't say that you shouldn't get into a relationship personally, but you do have a lot less time to just think about things than when you're single. When you're single, you kind of have a lot of time to just sit around and kind of like think philosophically and like the meaning of life and that kind of stuff. So there's benefit to both. Like you said, there's a support structure if you're dating someone that you don't have when you're single a lot of times, but there's pros and cons.
I don't know about the whole relationship thing because, Angela and I did the whole transition together. But I totally thought that where Briana was going to go was, when she was single, she had all this time to learn and kind of grow in relationship with the Lord. And then when she met Michael, then she had to, take on the responsibility of bringing him along, So I thought that's where she was going. And maybe it was. I don't know.
Yep. Now you have, so how many cats are you at now? 5 cats?
3.
3 going on 0.
No.
Wow.
What's wrong with the cats, Michael? Come on.
What association has light with darkness?
Thank you guys for joining us, though. Did you have anything else to add? If not, we'll probably just close out.
Hey, thanks for having us on.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been good. I think we got some good content tonight. Good advice for people.
I thought that was a really good discussion. We enjoyed having you on a lot, Dan. And, I think we're probably going to lose Paul. He's probably going to go back to be with the Lord here in the next year or two. And
it's the second time recently. He's just like, I'm a prophet. I'm going to prophesy Paul's death. Jeez.
I'm not a prophet. I just see the signs. It's different.
What are the signs?
Wrinkles, gray hair.
Wow.
At least she has
Slurred
it.
speech, memory loss.
Yeah, no, thank you both for coming on. I really appreciate it. Hearing your perspectives and your experiences.
Thank you.
Just kidding, Paul. I love you. You know that.
I think I know it.
I'm trying to keep this thing together, and y'all are just ripping it apart. I feel like I got keeping the ship together with bubble gum and duct tape. We thank you for tuning into this episode of the Outer Brightness Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Please visit the Outer Brightness Podcast page on Facebook. Feel free to send us a message there with comments or questions by clicking Send a Message at the top of the page, and we would appreciate it if you give the page a like. We also have an Outer Brightness group on Facebook where you can join and interact with us and others as we discuss the podcast, past episodes, and suggestions for future episodes, etc. You can also send us an email at outerbrightness@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you soon.
You can subscribe to the Outer Brightness podcast on Apple Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, Pocket Casts, Podbean, Spotify, and Stitcher. Also, you can check out our new YouTube channel, and if you like it, be sure to lay hands on that subscribe button and confirm it. If you like what you hear, please give us a rating and review wherever you listen and help spread the word.
You can also connect with Michael the Ex-Mormon Apologist at FromWaterToWine.org, where he blogs, and sometimes Paul and Matthew do as well.
Music for the Outer Brightness podcast is graciously provided by the talented Briana Flournoy and by Adams Road. Learn more about Adams Road by visiting their ministry page at adamsroadministry.com. Stay bright, fireflies.